There's something about a mystery, isn't there? A puzzle with missing pieces, a story without an ending. Here in America, we have a deep and enduring fascination with the unknown. We gather around television screens and listen to podcasts, drawn into the shadows of cases that defy easy answers. We pore over the details of crimes that linger for years, unsolved and unsettling. The names of the victims become etched in our collective memory, their stories fueling a nationwide desire for justice, for closure. It's a curiosity that walks hand in hand with a certain kind of dread, a feeling that evil can be both clever and patient. These stories remind us that darkness can touch any town, any street, at any time. This fascination is not just about the grim details. It's about the human element. It's about the detectives who refuse to give up, the families who never lose hope, and the communities that hold their breath, waiting for a breakthrough. We are captivated by the intellectual challenge of it all. We try to connect the dots, to see the patterns that investigators might have missed. We become armchair detectives, sifting through the evidence from the safety of our living rooms. The search for a faceless killer is a narrative as old as time, a classic tale of good versus evil, and we are always rooting for good to win. But every so often a case emerges that seems almost designed to be a mystery, a case with a phantom perpetrator who seems to enjoy the game, a killer who leaves behind cryptic clues, sending taunts and threats that feel like they're pulled from the pages of a Hollywood script. These are the stories that truly get under our skin. They challenge our sense of order and safety. The idea that someone isn't just committing a crime, but orchestrating a performance of terror is a uniquely chilling concept. It turns a simple investigation into a high-stakes psychological battle. And that brings us to a quiet suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. In the spring of 2001, a series of shootings began in East Point. The attacks seemed random, sporadic, and utterly terrifying. The killer gave himself a name, a simple one, Jack. He left behind notes, not to explain but to mock. He was a ghost, a whisper in the night, and for a short, terrifying time, he held a community in the grip of fear. This is the story of how that ghost was finally unmasked. A story of misdirection, forensic magic, and a family torn apart by a terrible secret. It's a true tale that proves sometimes the most baffling mysteries hide the simplest and most personal of motives. It all began on a cold winter night, the last day of February 2001. East Point, Georgia, was like any other suburb, a place where people felt safe in their homes and on their streets. But that sense of security was about to be shattered. Cynthia Roll, a dedicated and well-liked probation officer, was arriving home after a long day at work. She pulled her car into its usual spot, a routine she had performed countless times. But on this night, someone was waiting in the shadows, someone with a gun. And as Cynthia sat in her car, the quiet of the evening was broken by the sudden, violent roar of gunfire. When police arrived, they found a scene that was both tragic and puzzling. Cynthia Rolla had been shot multiple times at close range. It was a brutal, personal attack. Yet her purse and keys were untouched, lying right there in the car. This was no robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Investigators were immediately struck by the lack of evidence. There were no shell casings on the ground, which suggested the killer had used a revolver, or perhaps had been meticulous enough to collect them. The only real clues were the .40 caliber bullets recovered during the autopsy. Who would want to kill a probation officer with such cold precision? The question hung heavy in the air. The initial theory was obvious. Cynthia worked with convicted criminals every day. The most likely suspect was a disgruntled probationer, someone with a grudge against the system she represented. Investigators even had a promising lead. A composite sketch was created based on witness descriptions of a man seen fleeing the area. He was quickly identified as a probationer who lived nearby. An arrest was made. It seemed like a swift and logical conclusion to a terrible crime, but reality is rarely so simple. The man had a rock-solid alibi. He was on the phone at the exact time of the murder. He was innocent. The police were back at square one. And then, a tiny but crucial detail emerged, one that had been overlooked in the initial chaos. Tucked away inside Cynthia's car, almost hidden from view, was a small folded piece of paper. On it, written in bold yellow highlighter, was a single word: Jack. It meant nothing to the police at the time. It was just another strange piece of a puzzle they couldn't solve. They didn't know it yet, but that little note was a calling card. It was the first message from a killer who was just getting started. A killer who wanted them to know his name. The mystery had been given a title. For more than a month, the murder of Cynthia Rolu remained a chilling, isolated event. The case grew cold. The name Jack faded into the background, a strange footnote in a tragic file. But then came the night of April 8, 2001. Just as the residents of East Point were beginning to feel safe again, the phantom shooter returned. And this time, he was not content with a single act of violence. On that same night, Jack would strike twice, turning a quiet Sunday evening into a whirlwind of chaos and fear. The randomness of the attacks would send a new wave of panic through the community, making everyone feel like a potential target. The first victim of the night was Roger Orr, a 61-year-old man relaxing in his own home. He heard a knock at his door and went to see who it was. As he looked through his screen door, a figure emerged from the darkness and opened fire. Roger was hit in the arm and chest. Miraculously, he survived the attack. As police swarmed his home, they found a familiar signature. The shooter had left behind another folded note, this one bearing the name Jack. But this note had more to say. It contained a chilling message. "I've been locked up for 6 weeks. Someone must pay." It was a taunt, a clue designed to lead investigators down a very specific path. The message seemed to confirm the police's initial theory. The shooter was an ex-convict, someone recently released from jail, seeking revenge. The attack on a probation officer now made perfect sense. But as detectives processed the scene at Roger Orr's house, they got another call. Just a short drive away, another shooting had occurred. This time, the victim was Antonio Stefani. He had been shot while sitting in his car, but managed to run several houses down the street before collapsing. He did not survive. The two attacks, so close in time and location, were clearly connected. The killer was on a spree. At the scene of Antonio Stefani's murder, the evidence was more plentiful. Police found multiple .40 caliber shell casings scattered on the ground, a gift from a killer who was either getting sloppy or growing more arrogant. And of course, there was another note. This one was simpler, bearing only the name that was now becoming infamous throughout the city: Jack. Ballistics would later confirm that the casings from the Stefani and Orr scenes were fired from the same gun. The very same gun that had killed Cynthia Rolu. The killer wasn't just a phantom, he was a serial shooter, and he was just getting warmed up. With 3 attacks in a little over a month, the city of East Point was on edge. The name Jack was on everyone's lips, whispered in grocery stores and over backyard fences. He was a modern-day bogeyman, a faceless threat who could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The randomness was the most terrifying part. A probation officer, a retiree, a man in his car, there was no discernible pattern, no way to predict who would be next. The police were working around the clock, but the shooter seemed to be one step ahead. A ghost who materialized just long enough to pull the trigger before vanishing back into the night. The community was gripped by a collective anxiety. Just 4 days after the double attack, on April 12th, Jack made his presence known again. This time, his method was different, but his message was just as clear. The home of Barbara and Beulah Northern was suddenly pierced by the sound of shattering glass and a loud bang. A single bullet had been fired through their front window, striking their television set. No one was hurt. It wasn't an attempt to kill, it was an act of psychological warfare. It was the shooter reminding the city that he was still out there, that he could reach into any home he chose. It was a power play, designed to amplify the growing panic. Outside the Northern's home, investigators found what they were now expecting to find. A single .40 caliber shell casing lay in the grass, another perfect match to the previous shootings. And on the windshield of the family's car, tucked under a wiper blade, was the most terrifying note yet. It was another message from Jack, and it read, "You better count your body bags." The threat was no longer implied, it was explicit. The killer was promising more violence, more death. He was reveling in the fear he was creating, turning his crime spree into a public spectacle of terror. The city held its breath, wondering when and where he would make good on his promise. The investigation was now a massive, multi-agency effort. The pressure was immense. The probationer theory, fueled by the first murder and the note left at the Orr house, was still the leading angle. Investigators were combing through thousands of files, looking for any recently released convict who might hold a grudge. But the trail was cold. The shooter left behind just enough evidence to link the crimes, but not enough to identify himself. He was a master of misdirection, a puppet master pulling the strings of an entire city. And he had one more victim in his sights, the one he had been planning for all along. The spree of violence that had terrorized East Point came to a head on April 24, 2001. The final act of this dark drama would unfold in the concrete confines of an apartment complex parking garage. The victim was another probation officer, a woman named Rosa Lewis. She was a friend and colleague of the first victim, Cynthia Roll. As Rosa got out of her car after work, just as Cynthia had done weeks before, the killer who called himself Jack emerged from the shadows. He fired multiple shots at point-blank range, a brutal and shockingly personal assault. Rosa collapsed to the ground, her life hanging by a thread. This attack was different from the others. While the shootings of Roger Orr, Antonio Stefani, and the Northerns felt random and impersonal, this felt targeted. It was a mirror image of the very first murder. 2 probation officers, both women, both friends, shot as they arrived home from work. The randomness had been a facade, a smokescreen. The police now had a powerful new focus. The link between Cynthia Rolla and Rosa Lewis had to be the key. This wasn't about a grudge against the probation system. It was about a grudge against these 2 women specifically. The investigation had been thrown a lifeline. At the scene, investigators recovered the familiar .40 caliber shell casings, linking this shooting definitively to the others. Rosa Lewis was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. She was fighting for her life, but she was alive. She was the only person who had seen the shooter up close during a targeted attack and lived. If she could talk, she could potentially identify her attacker and bring this reign of terror to an end. But there was one strange inconsistency with this crime scene. For the first time since the murder of Cynthia Rolla, the shooter had failed to leave his signature. There was no note, no Jack. The absence of a note was, in its own way, a clue. Why would the killer, so arrogant and theatrical, suddenly abandon his trademark? Perhaps the reason was simple. The person he was targeting already knew who he was. There was no need to leave a name. As investigators began to dig into Rosa Lewis's life, a crucial piece of information surfaced. 5 days after her friend Cynthia Roll was murdered, Rosa had written a letter to her lawyer. It was a chilling premonition. The letter stated that if anything were to happen to her, the first person police should look at was her ex-husband, William Charles Lewis. The ghost finally had a possible face. With a new and promising suspect in their sights, investigators began to re-examine all the evidence they had collected. It was time to see if the pieces fit William Charles Lewis. The foundation of the case was built on ballistics. A firearms expert confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims and the shell casings from 4 of the 5 scenes all came from the same weapon, a .40 caliber high-point semi-automatic handgun. This proved that a single shooter, Jack, was responsible for all 5 attacks. The gun was the physical link, the thread that tied the bloody tapestry together. But the gun itself was still missing. The most unique evidence, of course, were the notes. These taunting messages, "Jack, someone must pay, count your body bags," were the killer's calling card. They had been carefully collected and preserved, and now they were subjected to intense forensic scrutiny. A latent print specialist named Shannon Wittes decided to treat the notes with 9-hydrin, a chemical used to reveal fingerprints. But what she found was something far more unusual. On the paper, a faint but clear impression began to appear. It wasn't a fingerprint, it was a lip print. A beautiful, perfect lip print. The killer had held the folded notes in his mouth while he was shooting. This was a breakthrough. Shannon Wittes knew that, like fingerprints, lip prints are unique. The specific pattern of creases and lines on a person's lips is a one-of-a-kind identifier. If they could get a sample from their suspect, they could make a comparison. But the notes held yet another secret. By holding the paper in his mouth, the killer had done more than leave a print. He had left his saliva. And where there is saliva, there is DNA. The small folded pieces of paper that were meant to taunt and mislead the police now held the killer's genetic blueprint. The evidence was irrefutable, a biological signature waiting to be matched. The final pieces of the puzzle were the witness statements about the cars. At the Antonio Stefani murder, a witness had seen a gold Malibu fleeing the scene. At the Rosa Lewis shooting, a different witness saw a blue Dodge Intrepid speeding away. This had initially confused investigators, suggesting there might be more than one person involved. But as they dug into William Lewis's life, it all started to make sense. The blue Intrepid was his personal car, and rental records would soon show that on the weekend of the Orr and Stefani shootings, he had rented a gold Malibu. The killer hadn't been a ghost after all, he was just a man with two cars. So who was William Charles Lewis? To the outside world, he was a pillar of his community. He was a deeply religious man, an active and respected figure in his church who even ministered to the congregation. People saw him as a kind, upstanding citizen. He had been married to Rosa Lewis for 23 years, and together they had raised a son. On the surface, he was the last person anyone would suspect of being a cold-blooded killer, a calculating predator who stalked his victims in the night. But behind the closed doors of his home, William Lewis was a very different man. His son, Antoine, would later describe a household ruled by fear. He characterized his father as controlling, domineering, and fundamentally dishonest. This was not the gentle churchgoer the public saw. This was a man with a volatile temper and a history of domestic abuse. Antoine recalled terrifying incidents, including a time when his father threatened his mother with a pot of boiling water. The man who preached love and forgiveness from the pulpit was a tyrant in his own home. This dark side was the key to understanding the motive behind the shootings. It was not random, it was personal. The motive was revenge, pure and simple. After 23 years of abuse, Rosa Lewis had finally found the courage to leave her husband. Her best friend, Cynthia Roll, had supported her and encouraged her to start a new life. In the twisted mind of William Lewis, Cynthia was the one to blame for the collapse of his marriage and his loss of control. So he decided she had to die. Cynthia Roll was his first and primary target. The murder was an act of punishment directed not only at her, but also at his ex-wife, Rosa. He was sending a message, but William Lewis was clever. He knew that the police would immediately suspect him if his ex-wife's best friend was murdered. So he devised a plan to create confusion. The random shootings of Roger Orr, Antonio Stefani, and the Northerns were all part of an elaborate deception. The notes, the probationer clue, the seemingly random pattern. It was all a smokescreen to throw investigators off his trail. His ultimate goal was always to kill the two women he held responsible for his anger, Cynthia Roll and Rosa Lewis. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, using his public persona to hide the monster within. The case against William Charles Lewis was building piece by forensic piece, but investigators needed to break his alibi. When they first brought him in for questioning, he was calm and cooperative, playing the part of the concerned ex-husband. He claimed to have been nowhere near any of the crime scenes. The key to shattering this facade would come from an unlikely source, his own son. Antoine Lewis was brought in to speak with detectives. It was a moment that required immense bravery. He had to choose between protecting his father and telling the truth. He chose the truth. Antoine systematically dismantled his father's alibis. He confirmed the history of abuse and his father's controlling nature. Crucially, he confirmed the details about the cars. He told police that yes, his father drove a blue Dodge Intrepid, and yes, his father had rented a gold Malibu on the very weekend that two people were shot. Antoine's testimony was the crack in the dam. It provided the context and the connections that the police needed to tie all the disparate threads together. The image of the respected churchgoer was crumbling, replaced by the portrait of a vengeful, manipulative killer. With their suspect's story falling apart, investigators moved in for the final checkmate. They obtained a warrant for William Lewis's DNA and lip prints. They took a blood sample and had him apply lipstick and kiss a piece of paper, just as a bank robber might be asked to provide a writing sample. The results were sent to the lab for comparison against the evidence found on the Jack notes. The wait was tense, but the outcome was certain. The DNA from the saliva on the notes was a perfect match to William Lewis's blood, and the lip print, that unique and beautiful print, was a perfect match to his lips. The science was undeniable. The forensics were absolute. William Charles Lewis was Jack. He was the man who had murdered Cynthia Rowley and Antonio Stefani. He was the man who had shot and wounded Roger Orr and Rosa Lewis. He was the man who had terrorized an entire community to cover his tracks. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the ballistics, the DNA, the lip prints, the cell phone records placing him at every scene, and his son's damning testimony, William Lewis had no choice. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The ghost had been caught. The capture and conviction of William Charles Lewis brought an end to the fear that had paralyzed East Point, Georgia. The monster who called himself Jack was no longer a phantom in the night, but a man behind bars. Justice, in a legal sense, had been served. The community could breathe a collective sigh of relief, secure in the knowledge that the random violence had a source, and that source was now contained. The headlines faded, the news vans drove away, and life slowly began to return to normal. But for those directly touched by the violence, the story is never truly over. For the victims who survived, like Rosa Lewis and Roger Orr, the scars run far deeper than the physical wounds. They are left with the trauma of a moment that changed their lives forever, a memory of staring into the face of inexplicable hatred. They must carry the weight of what happened, rebuilding a sense of safety that was so violently stolen from them. For the families of Cynthia Rowley and Antonio Stefani, there is no such thing as closure. There is only a permanent void, a lifetime of birthdays and holidays that will be spent with an empty chair at the table. A guilty verdict can provide answers, but it can never restore what was lost. This case also serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of mysteries, even after they are solved. For weeks, an entire community lived in fear, looking at neighbors with suspicion, jumping at sounds in the night. The psychological impact of such an event ripples outward, touching countless lives beyond the immediate victims. It erodes the trust we place in the world around us and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can hide in plain sight, even within our own families and communities. The resolution of the case doesn't simply erase that collective trauma. And so, while we are drawn to the puzzle and the suspense of a great mystery, the story of the Jack shooter reminds us that these are not just stories. They are real tragedies with real people at their heart. The intricate forensic work, the clever detective strategies, and the dramatic courtroom moments are fascinating, but they are all in service of a simple, profound goal to provide answers for those left behind. The legacy of this case is not just in the unique lip print evidence, but in the courage of a son who spoke the truth and in the memory of the lives that were senselessly altered by one man's vengeful rage.